George Harrison or Mick Ronson. I wouldn't say I grew up in a musical household because there were no upright pianos or guitars in our house, but we did have a stereogram in the front room. For any younger listeners, I guess I should explain what a stereogram was. Stereograms were rectangular wooden boxes on legs that were about the size of a small coffin. There was probably a huge clearing in the Brazilian rainforests in the late 60s and early 70s when they harvested the timber to build these boxes. They had a lid that lifted up to expose a turntable, a radio, and a small partition for your albums. The huge size was necessary to house the two speakers at a decent distance apart to enable the full stereophonic experience. They had a particular smell to them too. It was a combination of freshly sanded wood and dust frying on hot valves. My mum and dad had a record collection, with my dad's taste in music being more evident than my mum's to anyone browsing. My dad was a jazzer. Miles Davis, Thelonious Monk, John Coltrane and Dizzy Gillespie were a few of the appealing names you'd find under the lid of the big wooden box. The names of these guys suggested that they should be turning out at Madison Square Garden for the Harlem Globetrotters rather than blowing some brass in a smoky nightclub. I would hear my dad playing these records, but they never drew me in because of the lack of vocals. As a kid, I could never understand the appeal of instrumental music, let alone instrumental jazz. The only tunes I liked were the ones featuring Billie Holiday and Ella Fitzgerald. When I was deemed old enough, I was granted permission to use the record player, but there were few records in my parents' collection that I wanted to play. Ella Fitzgerald Sings Cole Porter was probably my first disc of choice. This album didn't sound like my dad's other records, and Cole Porter was probably considered as being pop music compared to Coltrane's Blue Train or Miles Davis's Early Miles. Even today, I still get shivers down my spine when I listen to Ella's version of Miss Otis Regrets. My other favourite album was Bridge Over Troubled Water. I loved the different atmospheres on that record. I didn't know about reverb or echo chambers then, but there was something I loved about that big crash that followed the lie la lie on the boxer and the echoing flute solo on So Long Frank Lloyd Wright. It was an epic album with great songs, great storytelling lyrics, and most worthy of the Grammy it won for Best Album in 1970. Years later, when I began my early experiments with effects for the guitar, it was always the echo pedal on the floor and the spring reverb in the amp that would put the biggest grin across my mug. I guess I have producer Roy Halley to thank for turning me into an echo freak. My mum's records didn't really float my boat, despite the fact that all of her records featured vocalists. Her favourite was Eddie Fisher, but Connie Francis and Patsy Cline would also get a spin. Like her sisters, she was also a bit of a country music fan and partial to a bit of Charlie Pride and Billy Joe Spears. These artists had some good songs, but at my age the men all sounded like singing cowboys, and their clothes suggested they should be on horseback at the Ice Chaparral instead of standing on stage at the Grand Ole Opry. The tune that got the most airplay in the front room was track 1, side 2 of the Concert Sinatra. There wasn't a copy of Jerry Marsden's version of You'll Never Walk Alone in our house, but there was a Sinatra version, and this was played every time the Subbuteo pitch was rolled across the front room carpet and the miniature Reds were brought out from their little box. I bought my first single when I was 9 years old. It was Papa Joe by The Sweet from nearby Broadway Records. My sister and I had a rota system, and we would each get 50p on alternate weeks to take down to the record shop and take home our little piece of black plastic magic. The early 70s were an exciting time for music if you were 10 years old. We had Gary Glitter's Rock and Roll Part 1, Leader of the Gang, and Hello, Hello, I'm Back Again. Cockney charmer David Essex with Rock On. But the pictures on my bedroom wall at that time were mostly of Slade and Susie Quattro, and a couple of pictures of Michael Jackson when he was still black. Top of the Pops was my church, and there were plenty of false eyelashed idols to worship. It was during one broadcast that I had my first musical epiphany. Piano intro, vocal, camera pans down past spiky red hair and stops at a pair of eyes arched in bright blue eyeshadow with mismatched pupils. 4 bars in and I was hooked. Who the fuck is this guy? Is he from outer space? He's singing about life on Mars, so maybe he's an alien. Whatever he is, I want to be in his gang. Gary Glitter can do one. Rick Wakeman's beautiful piano was punctuated at the bridge by Mick Ronson's cello arrangement. Dramatic and theatrical, and all before we got a full-length view of the guy in the powder blue suit with the feather cut. I was bitten by Bowie. I liked the glam rock of Glitter and the bombast of Slade, but this was something different. It was otherworldly. When my next turn on the 45 rotor came around, I could not get down to Broadway quick enough with my 50p gripped in my sweaty mitt. I got home and played it over and over, and then turned it over and played The Man Who Sold the World over and over. I had no clue what this spaceman was singing about, but I knew all the words by the end of the day. I wanted more. My dad was heavily involved with his trade union, and every year would go to a conference somewhere in the UK, and he would return with presents for my sister and I. Before I had bought my first single, I only owned one album, and that was a present brought home from a conference. The Beatles, 1966 to 1970. I was a fledgling guitarist in front of the mirror, and I wanted to be George Harrison. I thought he was the coolest Beatle by a mile, and everyone else liked Paul and John. I thought George's songs were the best, and the needle skipped about when I played that album, and usually ended up playing While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Something, or Here Comes the Sun. George didn't know it, that just round the corner lay a serious rival. My dad came home from his usual summer conference and gave me a 12-inch plastic bag from a record shop in Blackpool. I pulled the sleeve out of the bag, and there was my new spaceman hero standing under a streetlight with his guitar slung over his shoulder like a ray gun. The blue jumpsuit he was wearing would not have looked out of place on an Apollo mission. The inner bag was black and white with the lyrics on one side and individual pictures of the spiders from Mars on the other. This is the moment when George met his match. There he was, bottom right, Mick Ronson. There was no real clues to Ronson's guitar prowess on Life on Mars, and Starman wasn't giving much away either, apart from the repetitive guitar phrase that introduced the chorus, so I wasn't prepared for the combined salvo of Gibson Les Paul and Marshall Stack that was about to assault me and blow me away, and with it vaporise my worship of George Harrison. The record had everything. Bowie's hysterical screeching at the end of 5 years, countered by the baritone of the Spiders on backing vocals, the isolated echoing refrain in the chorus of Moon Age Daydream, the rock and roll piano and faux doo-wop backing vocals on Star, the sliding power chords on the intro of Suffragette City, and the grand finale that was rock and roll suicide. To quote Baloo the Bear, I was gone, solid gone. I had no idea about how you became a pop star, and my guitar work at that stage was more about posturing in front of the mirror rather than working on my chord shapes and changes. But I knew from that day on I wanted to be a musician. When you're a kid, your goals and ambitions change as often as your underpants. In the space of a week, you could go from wanting to be Roger Hunt on Monday, Steve Austin on Wednesday, and Neil Armstrong for the weekend. But Ronson was not to be a passing phase. He was in pole position, and he would remain there until 1977, when another gunslinger with the same white Gibson Les Paul would depose him.